right, welcome back to the Belonging at Work Summit. Our next guest is Vivienne Ming, a theoretical neuroscientist, technologist, and entrepreneur. Vivienne was named one of 10 women to watch in tech in 2013 by Inc. magazine. She co-founded SOCOS, where machine learning and cognitive neuroscience combine to maximize the life outcomes of students. She is also a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, where she pursues her research in neuroprosthetics. She sits on a number of boards, including StartOut and the Palm Center. She also frequently speaks on issues of LGBTQ inclusion and gender and technology. Given Vivienne's impressive credentials, we could take our conversation about the future of work as it impacts diversity, equity, and inclusion, workplace commitments, in so many different directions. So to get the most out of our limited time together, we're going to dive more deeply into discussing the role of technological advances like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other automations in the workplace, and how this rapid evolution, while it can be unsettling to some, has the power to serve as an inclusive force for good in society. So during our conversation, I'll be asking Vivienne to wear her futurist virtual reality goggles to help us visualize a future workplace that allows all of us to bring more meaning and authenticity into our work while having an honest dialogue about the power and pitfalls of these emerging technologies. So together, we'll explore how our organizations can adapt to help cultivate and sustain workplace cultures of growth. Okay, Vivienne, so welcome again to the summit. I'm super grateful that you're spending a little bit of your time today to lead us on this discussion as we explore the future of work together. So why don't you kick us off, and let's just first level set on some terminology that we'll be kind of using throughout today's conversation. So can you share with us just your own working definitions of artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms, automated systems, and really just to help us understand, are these one and the same, or are there important distinctions that we should be mindful of?
Sure, and thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to talking about this stuff. So definitions, level setting. Listen, to some people, this is very important. It's very important that we know the distinction between this, that, and the other. I will preface all of this by saying it could be a bunch of hamsters in a black box. It really doesn't mean anything. It's what the functional importance of this stuff, which is what we will work to. But just for the sake of everyone that really wants some actionable definitions, there's a very standard definition of artificial intelligence that I really love, which is it's any autonomous system that can make a decision under uncertainty. And I'm sure that sounds very wonky, but what chess move should I play? How fast should the car be driving as it makes a left turn? Is this resume worth advancing for an interview? There's no right answer to any of those questions. There's uncertainty in all of those worlds. And historically, only human beings could make those kinds of judgments. But it turns out it's not true anymore. Now it's trivially easy for AI systems to beat the best human chess players. It is not trivially easy for them to drive a car, but they can. And it's just the fact that they can is astonishing, even if they don't do it perfectly. Right. And of course, we're probably going to talk about those resumes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So now machine learning, in essence, it's a subfield of artificial intelligence. Whereas we could conceivably build an AI that simply is a whole series of logic statements. If this is true, then do that. And that's how it was originally approached way back in the 50s and the 60s. But it turns out that's not how our brains work. And it's not how modern artificial intelligence works. Instead, we are massive statistical engines. We collect enormous numbers of data about the world, and we essentially distill down the statistics of that information. Our brains do it in one particular set of ways. And machine learning systems, the modern version of artificial intelligence, even more precisely, deep learning or deep neural networks. These are these machine learning systems that can take billions of points of data. And in essence, in many, many cases, outperform human beings in traditionally purely human judgment spaces. And that last is where it actually becomes important. Unless someone wants to go build an AI or get a degree in machine learning, what's actually meaningful here is AI is any brief expert judgment made cheaper, faster, and increasingly better than a human can make it. And that's where its implications come in for the future of work. Mm-hmm. Because if we're talking about work that used to be intrinsically human, and let's be clear, we're going to get into this. I don't just mean driving cars or moving boxes. I mean, here's a spreadsheet, do a risk analysis. Here's a contract, find all the legal loopholes. Here is an x-ray. Should this be reviewed for a cancerous mole? Here is the specifications for a computer program. Go write the code. Increasingly, that is being done by machines. And that has huge implications for the future of work.
Absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of the uncertainty and some of the concern that workers in general have, knowledge workers that are doing this advanced thinking. And I think those definitions are absolutely helpful for us as we kind of go a little bit further and have that resume discussion as you were talking about. So when we're thinking about, the power of these technological advancements, can you share more about their role in helping us overcome unconscious biases to advance our organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments? And as you're thinking about that, I just want to give a refresher to participants around how we're talking about unconscious biases. So these are attitudes toward and stereotypes we may hold of other social groups that negatively affect our understanding, our actions, decision-making, which is a lot of what we're talking about today, in an unconscious way. So what might be some of the roles that you're seeing right now and how these technologies are trying to be a fail-safe and just pointing out, hey, an unconscious bias is arising? Like, where have you seen this done fairly well?
Yeah, so what's interesting is, as many of the viewers here may appreciate, is it in fact can have both effects, which is to make biases worse and as a tool that can address biases. And that becomes of crucial importance, because if you're building these things thinking that they are going to magically solve your problems, that this thing humans have never been able to figure out, which is how to be inclusive, is just somehow an AI is going to figure it out for us. I have a starting rule, which is, if you don't know how to solve a problem, AI will not solve it for you. The thing that it can do, and this is what's important for the positive side of this, is if there are things that can work, AI can completely change the economics of that. So if I knew that I could have an incredibly well-trained person that, for example, could look at a resume and pick up on some of the parts of it that may read in biased ways to someone. So famously, women tend to say we instead of I on resumes. And we know that recruiters respond more strongly to I. It has nothing to do with whether women or men are better at the job. But we respond to I, we don't respond as strongly to we in equitable candidates. So that becomes an incredibly important thing to know. If the human bias is for that strong candidate that says, I solved the problem, but the resume says, my team worked hard and we solved the problem. If otherwise everything looks the same, wouldn't it be great if the AI could come in and flag not the person writing it? That's where a lot of people put the burden here, but the person reading it. And we've done exactly that. In fact, in my own work years ago, under a completely different political regime, I used to spend time at the White House going and visiting and working on what they called data jams. And one of those was with the Office of Personnel Management, essentially the HR department of the federal government. So 6 million employees, 200 million resumes go through their system every year. There probably is no higher throughput HR system in the world. And we got a hold of this data, anonymized. So it was all just coded up, but consistently coded. And what I tried to build, and I will keep this more metaphorical than technical, is a pair of glasses. So that when a recruiter opened a resume, the glasses corrected for their known bias. How do we know they have bias? Because they've been hiring people for years. And without even idealizing bias, if we simply said, based on your hiring history in the past, and then how people performed inside the federal government, where are your biases? So what we built was a system that could color code the resumes. So, but it was unique for you. A different person would have seen a different color coding. So the number one area of overvalue, an Ivy League degree. So in our system, almost everyone would see the fact that someone went to Harvard in bright red on the resume. Not because going to Harvard is not worthwhile, but because it is consistently overvalued. The number one negative thing across almost all resumes is a female name. So you almost always see female names in blue. But then it's a mishmash. Everything's different. The viewer has different things. The person who created the resume in the first place has different biases. Trying to create a system that would allow a recruiter to correct for their own misunderstandings of the world. I felt like it was really powerful. It was exciting to see it work. And it really gets at the heart of this idea that you could build a machine learning system, an AI, that wouldn't decide who gets hired, that wouldn't simply tell you you're a bad person, but instead would say, you know what, you have this consistent challenge, and every time it pops up, I'm going to remind you of it. But it's still going to be your decision. So I was really taken with that idea because a consistent other experience I have, for example, I gave a keynote for this big event once for young female executives, and the closing keynote with Gina Davis. That was a lot of fun chatting with her. But the first half of the day was exactly what I just described. Women say we more. Women don't speak up as much. Women have all of these consistent behaviors that are undervalued. And so if you'd asked me at midday following my keynote how the second half of the day was going to go, I would have said it's obvious. It's going to be a long session of let's burn this motherfucker down and start over again. Why is it that we're making our biases the problem of those young women? They weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't worse at their jobs because they said we were worse at our jobs because we wanted even though it isn't actually predictive of people doing better work. Yeah. So building these kinds of AI systems that can help correct for that. But let me contrast. So I got a very swanky job, let's call it inquiry, a few years ago to be the head, the chief scientist for people at Amazon. And one of the many things I would have done was lead a machine learning project that they were putting together to predict who Amazon should hire. And the reason they were interested is because I'd been the chief scientist of one of the very first companies to ever do this, use modern large-scale AI to source employees. And it was our tagline of our startup. We take bias out of the hiring process. We bring meritocracy back to tech hiring. That's its own set of stories. But in the case of Amazon, I told them when I went up to visit that it wouldn't work. And they built it anyways. And of course, it didn't work. And it got a lot of press subsequently. Essentially, what happened is they built this very well-intentioned system using a very fancy deep neural network. But what they built was take all of their historical hiring data, all of the people they'd ever hired, then try and predict, for example, who would get a promotion in the first year. Of course, they have all the ground truth there. They know everything. So they hired a bunch of very smart people to come in and build exactly that system. And it wouldn't hire women. Now, that came out clearly in the press. I virtually guarantee you it wouldn't hire people of color. To the degree that you could pick up on it, it probably wouldn't hire queer people. And I'm not saying that it wouldn't do this because Amazon is explicitly sexist, racist, or anything else. It's doing this because that's Amazon's history. And they got trapped in that illusion that AI would solve their problem for them. We've never been able to figure out how to hire people fairly. Somehow AI will magically figure it out for us.
Yeah.
What's amazing about AI is, in fact, it was so good at what it was asked to do, which is find the kind of people we've hired in the past. So what they did for a year was, all right, it won't hire anyone that uses the words women's in their resume. So we'll take all the gendered language out and we'll retrain it. And it went and found out how, if a person was a woman, it discovered, it sleuthed, it did anything it had to not hire women, because that's what Amazon wouldn't do in its hiring history. And I'm not, again, claiming that Amazon was doing that with malicious intent, but that was their history, same as it is for almost all tech companies. And they had this delusion that AI would solve their problem for them. So there you have contrasting cases where if you really target something explicit, something you know you could make a difference in, AI can become an amazing tool. If you just broadcast broadly and cross your fingers and imagine you live in Narnia, you get nowhere.
Right. And it goes back to your general rule, right? Which is, if you know how to solve the problem, excuse me, if you know how to solve the problem, you can, it's almost like economies of scale. You can maximize that. But if you haven't done the work in real time as humans to figure out how do we solve this problem of a lack of women, a lack of people of color, a lack of LGBT folks, et cetera.
And needless to say, you know, inclusion, diversity, if these were easy to solve problems, we'd have solved them.
Right.
And so it's like the classic example of a hard problem.
Yeah.
And again, thinking statistics will solve that problem for you is obviously pretty naive. And particularly this, which is, I'll add in one last technical detail. Modern deep neural networks, the face of almost all modern AI, is strictly correlation. It doesn't know what's really going on. It is a massive engine for mapping a huge number of numbers down to a smaller set of numbers. And again, if that mapping, if essentially what it's being told is, you know, find the kind of people we'd hire in the past, it will look for the strongest correlations. And strong correlation is straight white man,
Right.
even if that's not what you wanted. However, that is not a causal relationship. You know, if we really wanted causal relationships, if we forced it to find causal relationships, it wouldn't get trapped up, at least in these same sets of biases.
Right.
And in that sense, I think that there is a future for a big change in this space, but it is not here yet. So people should remember, in the space that we're discussing, AI isn't learning what makes a great employee. What it is learning is what correlates with the employees you've hired before.
Right. Yeah. It's looking at the data that already exists over the years that Amazon has existed, and kind of driving decisions around that. And so, you know, with your expertise as a neuroscientist, let's go into the why. Like, help us understand why artificial intelligence, machine learning, automated systems, the technologies we're talking about right now, designed in theory to make our lives a little bit easier, is exacerbating, you know, our unconscious biases because we're not being intentional about the design. And then maybe we can jump into how we can be a little more intentional. But just, can you just help us understand a little bit more about the why and what's going on right now?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that's truly fascinating about artificial intelligence is it will only ever reflect our own ethical choices back at us. Its very nature of it as a correlation engine is it picks up on trends. It picks up on the grand sweep of data. It can find amazingly sophisticated relationships, but again, there's no constraint here that those relationships really tie to what causes someone to be successful on the job, what causes a student to perform well in school or later in life, what is an actual causal relationship in a police report that should get someone to be arrested or get probation versus not, or any of these judgments. Should I get a loan? Well, the easiest way to answer that question is just to say, well, of all the people that have gotten loans before, who are you most like, and what do we see in the correlations of paying back the loans? And, you know, let's throw this in, the bank making a little money on the side. Well, that's very different than saying, what do we know about Vivienne Ming that is causal in her both paying back the loan and the bank being successful?
Mhm.
And it may sound like it's the same thing, but it turns out it just fundamentally is not. And so in that last case, for example, is often referred to as algorithmic redlining, because historical loan behavior has obviously favored some populations in America quite intentionally over others. So even if those policies are gone, that historical data is still there. The consequences of that historical policy is still there. So now I train up an AI to figure out who to give a loan to, and it wants to give it to rich white conservatives from religious backgrounds because they are the people most likely historically to have paid back their loans. But it turns out that is not a modern causal relationship between loan repayment and the individuals that we're looking at. So it becomes really frustrating when all of these things are truly telling the world is this is what history looks like,
Right.
which is unfortunately where we get trapped.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, the algorithmic redlining that you talk about. So it's this kind of taking the history that we have in real time and bringing that into the virtual space. And so I'm sure you and many other experts in your space are thinking about how do we mitigate this and how do we attempt to kind of scrub as much bias as we can out of these algorithms. So what are some of the challenges that arise when you have these best intentions when you're going in, like as you described your role at Amazon, right? And this kind of effort to say, whoa, we're looking around, there's a lot of straight white cis guys around, like how do we change this? And best intentions and kind of creating this product, but then you realize after it's kind of doing its thing, like, whoa, okay, there were unknowns of the unknowns, right? Like we're looking downstream and now we've created this kind of Frankenstein. What are some of the other challenges that you now know kind of in the work that you've done, and as you offer advice to other folks in the space of how to kind of work
Yeah.
with this?
So there's been a lot of work looking at algorithmic bias, which is to say the kinds of biases we actually embed into the algorithms themselves. And I take a couple of unusual positions here. One is something I've alluded to already, which is I have a pretty fundamental belief, born by both my research and a large body of other research, that if we truly knew what caused people to be successful in the job, it would strip away almost all of the hiring bias we see to date.
Mm-hmm.
What we know is people that are resilient are more successful in the job. We know that people that have better perspective taking skills, that have richer self-assessment or analogical reasoning, that these are things that are very predictive of long-term career and life outcomes. But they express themselves differently across different kinds of people. So if this is what we're looking for, and we don't know how to read someone that's different than us, then we're going to fall back on two things. One is favor the people that are most like us, or more accurately, most like whatever the cultural norm is you're hiring in, or look for a fancy smancy university degree that did that work for me. So it's always safe to hire someone from Ivy League schools. That's why that bias I mentioned earlier exists. It's not because it was a bad idea. It's just people overvalue it because it's the only safe place. It's like the US stock market right now. It's going up not because the economy's great, but because it's worse everywhere else. So people are throwing money into our market and it causes it to rise. Seems really perverse, but that's the way it works. So same thing here. It's not that an Ivy League degree is bad, but because it's the simplest, easiest place for a recruiter to hang their hat, that's where they go, way more than it would otherwise account for. So one area that I'm a bit perverse, perhaps, I hope not though, is if we really knew what made people great, then all of these other issues would disappear. That might be an idealist to me, but at least is one of my starting points. The other is, and here anyone watching that really is invested in the AI and bias space might have their hairs get raised on the back of their neck, is the standard approach to tackling algorithmic bias today is to tackle the data itself. So what did Amazon do when their system wouldn't hire women? They tried to manipulate the data. First, we'll take out all the gendered language in the data set and retrain it. Wow, somehow it still figures out not to hire women. We will take out all of the statistical numerical bias. So maybe there are just more men than women in the data set. So we'll create huge numbers of sort of artificial women to balance it out. We'll create all these sorts of things. Pretty soon, this isn't anything like the real world anymore. Mm-hmm. I take the position that if your algorithm won't hire the better candidate, it's not the data, it's your algorithm that's wrong. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying this while also fully acknowledging the overwhelming approach to algorithmic bias today is balancing and improving data sets. And it's a perfectly valid approach given the limitations of our technology today, but it's not going to solve our problem. Again, it's a lot like sending your algorithm to Narnia, some world where good and evil is really crystal clear, and then somehow hoping that when you bring it back into the real world, it will make all the right judgments. And in fact, it'll just create different sorts of biases, maybe better than it was before, which is why it is a valid approach today. But ultimately, this is not the solution to our problem.
Right. And there's value of visioning, right? Of imagining Narnia and having maybe one foot in Narnia while you're here. But what I'm hearing from you too is also this importance of going back to the research on what makes people great and really doing that hard work, because we have, as you said, some indicators of resiliency and these different trends that kind of get us to that direction of what makes what's an ideal candidate great. And in terms of leaders watching this right now, suspending what we could be doing to retrain data, right? Which seems like that's a kind of part of the equation, but the harder work is on us as humans. So what work does a leadership team have to do in advance to be honest about the unconscious biases that they're trying to tackle in the workplace before kind of calling you up to say, hey, Vivienne, we need help in designing the algorithms to do this thing? Because I think that's where you start, right?
Yeah, boy, there are answers on so many levels to this question. I mean, a very immediate and grounded one is there are some places where rebalancing the data sets work. So for example, a space I've worked in for a long time, which is face recognition. We know from repeated failures of face recognition systems that they're not good with dark-skinned faces, and they are less good with female faces. So if you're a dark-skinned female, and yet in the real world, people are using these systems for job interviews, for border control, for police security, you'd have very good reason to think, well, you're playing with my life with a system that is not ready for release. So there's been some great work, for example, at MIT, building these balanced data sets, because this is, in some respects, a pretty clear case where if we just had more dark-skinned faces in the training sets, the algorithms would be less biased. But it turns out, even to nuance that story, there are differences in the optics of cameras and how they engage with really dark-skinned faces. And that's a problem that has to get solved also. So even there, we might need to take the story deeper than just data. But let's go way to the other end. No technology at all. Ask yourself, leader, this question first. Does my company truly value diversity? And I don't mean, do you wish it did, or what do you perceive to be true about yourself? I mean a brutally honest question, because depending on your answer to that, the next step is wildly different. Right. The research over the last, say, decade has become crystal clear. All of the kinds of anti-bias interventions we might run will only ever work in a culture that values diversity. So in other words, you may really think that people that bring something different to the table bring value, but you still have challenges with where your biases are and what your expectations are. Maybe you think you're a venture capitalist and you think all gay entrepreneurs, somewhere in the back of your head, all gay entrepreneurs are only good at lifestyle companies. Well, it's not true. Right. But we see that in the data very strongly. entrepreneurs, gay entrepreneurs, are much more likely to be funded for lifestyle companies and much less likely to be funded than predicted for, say, a hardware company. So you get ironically, you get an advantage by fitting a stereotype. We see this also in the recent Harvard lawsuit case about Harvard admissions. Chinese men are more likely to get in than would be predicted if they fit the stereotype of being bookish test takers, and less likely to get in if they break that stereotype and are more well-rounded. Yeah. So it's less about Chinese versus white and more about whether you fit a stereotype or not. So stuff like that happens. It's real. It's not that it's inescapable, but it's an everyday part of human existence. If you are truly committed to breaking those sets of behaviors, you're in one camp, and there are things we could do, things like counter stereotypical exemplars, and whether we're invoking machine learning or not, established practices. If, however, you do not have a culture that values inclusion, values diversity, now you've got a culture problem. And that's a completely different space. Right. That's a longer term problem. It takes a very different approach. It takes astonishing leadership and role modeling. It probably takes population change within your company. And you have to be willing in the near term to make sacrifices if you're hoping to gain the benefits in the long term. The benefits are there. I've run research. Many people have run research. I think that the economic value of diversity is crystal clear. In fact, as we take this conversation a little further, I think diversity becomes almost the entire game, broadly defined, for the future of work. But you have to believe it. And if you don't, nothing else I say matters until you've been able to be honest with yourself about your organization.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of if-then scenario for the leaders to kind of start there first. And then thinking about the fact that technology is here, and that's part of the future of work as well. It reminds me of the book Weapons of Math Destruction, written by Kathy Ming in 2016. So in her book, so she writes about, she uses the analogy of talking about car companies and basically saying, a car company wouldn't design a car and send it out to market, without knowing whether or not it's safe. And so there are safety standards that are built in terms of car design. And by that same token, machine learning in particular, kind of this really kind of deep thinking about making decisions, I think we're in agreement that we want to see fairness around that and kind of consider the legal implications there.
One bit of fun irony for me is I'm actually in that book, I think, because I've never read the whole thing, as a bit of a villain.
Oh, no.
The irony is I actually entirely agree with her. And, I was the chief scientist at Guild, the company that was doing the AI for hiring. Okay. And needless to say, in our marketing, we had big, broad statements. But what we actually did was, in my research, was build little targeted machine learning systems that said, are you resilient? Yeah. It looked at the things we knew were true of the best employees, right, and targeted that. And I think somehow in the disconnect between the actual work we were doing, my personal beliefs, and what she picked up, because she never actually interviewed me for the book, she just took a quote out of context, was, and here's an example of a company that was claiming they could just take all this data and fix hiring. And I agree. Part of my experiences there was a real demonstration that she couldn't, that was the mistake. Yeah. Which is why I became so engaged with the idea that no, you need to know what you're doing first, at a human level, first. There are only ever messy human problems. They only ever have messy human solutions.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you being so gracious with one kind of being characterized as a villain and maybe not having that opportunity to talk more in depth about what you were actually doing and maybe some of the internal kind of barriers that you were navigating as well. But on that point, right, of just kind of looking at the safety standards that are kind of in other industries, like automobile industry, for example, from your perspective, what might be some ways that we can get more transparency in the design of algorithms and this by making sure that decisions that are made impacting our reality that the folks that are being impacted have the ability to see how that decision was made if it wasn't made by a human, right? If it was done.
Yeah. So I actually have a piece coming out soon, which may in fact be out before anyone sees this in person.
Okay.
And the title of it is One GPU, One Vote. And it's really about not how artificial intelligence as a technology, but how it's being used by people may simply be incompatible with civil rights. And I realize that sounds like a very provocative statement, but keep in mind, so many of the things we've already touched on in this conversation, whether you get a loan, whether you get a job, whether your kid goes to a particular university, whether you get through border security, get on a plane, get bail, every one of these these experiences, fundamental experiences that in many cases are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, but are otherwise clearly statements of what it means to live a life of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. These are now being made judgments by algorithms, and you're not even aware of it. If you didn't pick up on what I was explaining earlier, what my old company Guild used to do was a sourcing tool. We would go find people and recommend that companies would reach out to them. So in the time we've been having this conversation, everyone watching it, everyone has been passed over for thousands of jobs. And they didn't even realize it. They never applied for those jobs. You've been passed over for loans, at least implicitly. Your kids have been passed over for scholarships and schools, at least more and more so as AI is able to take more role in these judgments. Now, I'm not saying that AI shouldn't be involved, because the simple truth is, if it can make a better judgment, I think often in combination with human beings, then I want it to play a role. If we simply say no to AI, people die of diagnosable cancer. I built one of the first AIs to treat diabetes because my son was diagnosed, and I thought it was unacceptable that life-threatening illness was treated by people just eyeballing handwritten numbers and making best guesses about what to do next. So I built an AI that decided exactly how much insulin he should get at each moment, and it was transformative. But along with that, yes to what's possible, there needs to be a healthy respect for how we address some of the serious threats. By serious threats, I don't mean Skynet. No one has invented AI that's smarter than us. In fact, I would go further to say no technology invented today will ever become an AI that is smarter than us. I'm not saying it's impossible for such a thing to be invented, but it hasn't been invented yet. So instead, what I'm talking about is how people use it. So here are three very concrete examples of things we could do to make certain those judgments are fair. One is audits. The financial industry has, kicking and screaming, entered into a norm of their transactions being audited. It is very standard for public corporations required for public corporations to have an independent auditor come in. And the times when they're not independent, you see what happens, WorldCom, and these sorts of things are fundamental to the healthy functioning of the financial world. Because if people on the outside of a financial institution didn't know what was really going on internally or outside of a public company, how could you ever safely invest in them? Well, I think the same thing is true in the big data world. Tech companies and others, everybody's a tech company nowadays. Every big organization in the world is a big data company. They need to have their data audited. They need to prove to people that they are being responsible with that data, and that the judgments that are being made with that data are lawful and respectful. And if they're not willing to do it, then they should be forced out of business. This needs to be a norm. Now, the reason that works in the financial world is big, powerful organizations need to know about big, powerful organizations. That made auditing a norm. Here I'm talking about citizens versus big, powerful organizations. That's harder to deal with. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Another approach is maybe we need something like the CDC or the World Health Organization. The Ebola breaks out in Central Africa, and the World Health Organization shows up to stop it before it kills, or SARS, or whatever might be going on. The CDC started here fighting malaria. Well, what if we had the same thing, but for artificial intelligence, really out there? These are people that love AI, otherwise they wouldn't be good at their job. But they're looking, in a sense, for outbreaks, hotspots where AI is gone awry. They could be groups of people that themselves do audits, or they could be working from the outside. They could be governmental or not. But this is one thing we should seriously think about. Is it's very hard if I am a candidate for a job to actually have a meaningful influence on a company that's using AI in a way which essentially bars me from employment. Maybe they didn't even intend it, but that's what's going on via their algorithms. But some larger organization that could actually pick up on those trends could play a balancing role. And then that brings us to maybe the final, which is, well, what if the individuals, the citizens themselves, could be empowered? And I'm not going to go into detail here because it's very technical and new ideas, but there are many ideas out there like data collectives and data trusts where people actually get together, bring their data into a collective with infrastructure, develop their own AI systems. So instead of an AI deciding whether they get a job, they have their own AI that's pitching them as an employee. Instead of waiting to get a loan, they have AIs going out and saying, no, my guy should get a loan. He is awesome. Or my gal deserves bail. We've run all the numbers. And so this is the idea. And the nice thing about the data trust idea is it's legally well specified. It's something that might sound futuristic or outlandish right now. But if we're really talking about how do we create a balance of power by which AI does right, then this is what it needs to be. Because let me be clear, a lot of people talk about the problems with AI being when it doesn't work right. Algorithmic bias, for example. I actually am just afraid of a world where it does work exactly as planned, but it only serves a vanishingly small number of people.
Yes.
And we really need to change that relationship around.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to your concerns that you raised around human and civil rights, which I'm really glad that you brought that up. I did a little bit of research before, and I'm really grateful that you talked about some kind of watchdog group, whether that be an international group like the World Health Organization, or in the United States, a federal agency of some sort. As well as these kind of data trusts that are driven by citizens, individuals. There's one group that I did some research on called the Partnership on AI, which it was designed, and I think it's more of a nonprofit model that brings together a collaboration of the big tech, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, IBM, et cetera. What's your take on kind of nonprofits or collaboratives that are made up of tech companies, and recognizing that there's a growing, there's pressure from people, consumers that are engaged with their products or services of kind of saying, okay, transparency is important and we're going to shine a light on how we develop our algorithms. What's your take on the effectiveness of something like that?
So starting in, I think, the 70s, there was a growing scientific consensus that lead in paint and fuel was a terrible thing, that it was truly having negative consequences on people's lives. The early research in that had started even before, and the single biggest barrier to passing legislation on removing lead from our daily lives, something now which is, it's frightening, it's terrifying to think all the paint in your house was filled with lead. We know, like at a mathematical level, something like 4 grams of lead per deciliter in your blood reduces IQ by 4 points, or something along those lines. Like horrible consequences, both at a health and wellness standpoint and an economic one. And yet it took forever because the lead industry fought it tooth and nail. They had a self-interest to keep this in there and to suppress the research. And in deregulation in the 80s, almost all these restrictions were almost repealed. It wasn't until a piece of research was done at the time that showed directly the economic consequence of having lead in our environment. Like, there is no safe level of lead, that it truly changed everyone's opinion. I'm not saying this because the people in the lead industry were villains. You know, it's not Dr. Doom. No one was trying to destroy the world, but they had a driving self-interest. It was an entire industry to keep it in the market. And they had a lot of colluders like paint and the petroleum industry, whose products worked better when they had lead in them, and they became more engaging products. So if we're now talking about Google and Facebook and Amazon and Baidu and Alibaba, I don't have to imagine that Jeff Bezos or Jack Ma are bad people. I just have to imagine that they're human. Mm-hmm. And it's wonderful that these groups want to get together and establish norms for the safe use of artificial intelligence. That's legitimate because there are these times when AI doesn't work right, and those are addressable. We could collaborate on how to do it right. But I'm actually talking about when it does work right, but it only works for a small number. Mm-hmm. And that to me is even more pernicious. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's great, but manifestos and checklists and guidelines and good intentions do not solve messy human problems. Yeah. So I think we need to take a bigger and more legitimate ownership of this at a societal level, rather than hoping, you know what, it'd be really great if the lead industry would just take lead out of all of these products, because they don't want to. That's not good for their business. And they're not villains. They're just humans that are taking a lot of extra convincing because it's all downside for them.
Yeah, that's a great response, and thank you for sharing that analogy. I think that's really helpful, just to kind of understand, you know, the role of some of these larger tech companies, and, you know, operating out of self-interest and wanting to kind of keep moving forward without the painful process of slowing down a little bit to be more accountable to those folks that they're serving, right?
And I will say again, without rancor, Jeff Bezos and Larry Page do not strike me as guys that care about accountability. Mm-hmm. I don't mean this again in some villainous sense. Just sure. You know, if you're some of the richest, smartest people in the world, yeah, you may not believe anyone has a better insight than you do on these issues, and so they may genuinely think that they're doing everything exactly right in the service of everyone else. And I still say, you're still human.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a really important reminder. You know, for the folks that are watching right now, our summit participants, you know, what's one thing about, you know, the future of work and the technologies we've been talking about, and their potential to serve as an inclusive force for good in society that we haven't discussed yet that we probably should? So anything.
Yeah, I think there's something so crucial. I have whole stories to tell about the future of work, and we're not going to have time to get in all of them. But if I could convey one thing, let's go back to how I opened it all up. Mm-hmm. AI is a technology that can make any brief expert human judgment cheaper, faster, and increasingly better than a human can make it. So what's the implication of that for work? And keep in mind, these judgments, economically, the sweet spot is the professional middle class. All of those people that went to university, those people that are essentially a bottleneck in a giant corporation, a very expensive bottleneck on multiple scales. If I could get rid of all the people writing code, maybe not all of them, 80% of them, if I could get rid of 80% of the lawyers having to laboriously read contracts, or of the doctors, you know, I'm paying $5,000 to take 10 seconds to look at an x-ray. Imagine all of that goes away and an AI makes an expert judgment in their place. And it's nearly as good. Would the AI know what to do with those contract loopholes? Would it know how to treat that patient? No, but those judgments would suddenly be made in seconds, maybe milliseconds, compared to taking hours for a human being, and made in milliseconds at virtually no cost. So now the future of work, one dimension of that. Think of your job. Could someone of roughly the same education and a similar background effectively do your job, or 80% of it? If the answer to that is yes, and I hate to break it to many of you, the answer for most of you should be yes, then that job as you know it is going away. The things that make us sort of boringly the same are exactly the same things that jerks like me can automate. What's left then in all of this? I mean, that's a scary story in and of itself. A total big revolution in the way work gets done. It isn't that whole jobs disappear, but most of the time we're used to putting in. Surely, like, for example, the massive outsourcing industry in India, all of that disappears because they are, by virtue of the job, you know that someone else could do it. And we're already seeing that onshoring of work, not back to humans in North America, but back to machines. So here's the silver lining. And for me, it's not silver, it's platinum. It is amazing. If the things that make us boringly the same disappear, then your value to society, your fundamental economic value, is what makes you different. And in fact, the more different you are, the more valuable you are, which makes my son priceless. And that's amazing. But that is such a different approach to work. Set aside the fact that AI might be driving this story. Now we're in a fundamentally human space. What is work if people's value is that they're different? Well, then it sure as hell isn't leaders telling people what to do. It's not Six Sigma. It is not, let's build a strong hierarchy where people execute on plans they're given. What's the point of me hiring a brilliant, creative explorer and then telling them what to do? I guess my best analogy is what's sometimes called the Hollywood model, where you just bring a lot of very talented people together on a big project, and it's assumed that the cinematographer knows how to take pictures, and the actors know how to act, and the costume designer knows how to build an engaging visual, and so forth and so on. It's not the director or the producer's job to make those decisions. It's just their job to explain why those decisions need to happen in this story. So what if all of work became that? Now, I'm a big sci-fi geek, so I like to use this as a counter example. The wrong version of this is Star Trek. I wish it was better than it is, but like most science fiction, it's got its flaws. And the biggest flaw in Star Trek is it's supposed to be this future, right? It's the future that had the first interracial kiss, even if they were being mind controlled to do it. It is the future that had people from all these backgrounds come together, where everyone is this amazing, self-actualized creative. And yet, whenever the shit hit the fan and the Klingons were attacking, everyone would just turn and look at the captain and wait to be told what to do. That is the exact opposite of the future of work as I hope for it. So let me be clear. You asked me to put on my futurist goggles at the beginning of this. I'm not really a futurist. I can make some predictions simply because some things seem pretty clear. But the simple truth is, the way I look at this is we have a whole bunch of choices in front of us. And if we make one set of choices, we end up in one broad area. If we make another set of choices, we end up in another broad area. Ironically, the thing I can say about the future most concretely is I don't know what it is. 10 years from now, what will work be like? Anyone that tells you that they know is lying. They're selling you something. And yet, if you read every future of work policy paper, it is essentially the answer to the following question. Predict one specific future, and then the one skill everyone should know in that future, which is insane. Imagine planning your investment strategy that same way. I don't know what the economy would be like 10 years from now, but predict the one single company that I should put all of my money into, such that in 10 years it will pay off the biggest. You can't. It's essentially an impossible prediction. So what should we do instead? Build people for the unknown. Mm-hmm. We should build amazing, creative, adaptive, resilient, empathetic problem explorers. Then let them go figure out what they ought to know. That is the future of work. And the first step for that is for leadership to understand how that looks dramatically different than how they're running their companies today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love the platinum lining that you shared, and maybe that feeling of being able to adapt and explore in the unknown is, being the artist of the future, being the artist of your own life, of your own career, and having that blank canvas. I think that's a very positive note to end on. So
it is a good one. And I mean, really think hard. What if every job was a creative job? Yeah. Whether you're writing code or cutting open bodies or painting pictures or exploring science or whatever it is, or cleaning up the office. Every job is a creative job, or it's automated. Yeah. And I think there are still some real challenges and scary points in that future, but there is an amazing thread, a set of choices we could make, which would point us in a much better direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Vivienne, I think there are many more stories that you can tell. And so I want to make sure that people can find those stories. And so can you share with us like the single best place to find you online and to hear some of the amazing talks that you do and other good stuff that you've produced so far?
Well, thank you for saying all of that. If you come visit us at Sokos Labs. So I started this crazy mad science lab where we work on life-threatening illnesses and inclusion and education and innovation and anything that involves human beings. And we do it all for free. So people bring us problems and I pay for everything. And if we invent a solution, we give it away. If you come and visit sokos.org, SOCOS.org, you can, for one thing, pitch us a mad science experiment. And if we're interested, we might give it a try. But the other thing you can do is find a lot of our writing and our talks. You can sign up for our newsletter. So every month we put out a new long form piece, a story about one of our crazy mad science experiments. And you can learn about what it really means to solve problems in people's lives. And unfortunately, to not always succeed, because if we knew it would work, it wouldn't be science. And if anyone else was doing it, it wouldn't be mad.
Sure.
So come for a visit, see the kind of work that we do, pitch us a crazy project, because if I think we can make a unique contribution in that space, then we'll do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I've learned a ton, and I hope that so many people who are watching right now are inspired by what's in store for the future and actively co-creating to make that happen. So thank you, Vivienne. And for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want to get more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing the work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all of these amazing talks and other helpful goodies by using the link below. And for every purchase, it also helps me pay amazing speakers like Vivienne and other folks who have so generously shared their wisdom and labor in helping us all grow the belonging movement. So thanks again, and thanks for today's featured belonging champion, Vivienne Ming. All right, take care.